in the grand halls of Eldermere Palace, where whispered secrets echo louder than spoken truths, one man's loyalty would be tested beyond all limits. Captain Marcus Thornfield had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life, but no training had prepared him for the day he would have to choose between duty and conscience. When the most innocent member of the royal household became the target of calculated cruelty, a decorated soldier's composure would finally crack, setting in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. What happens when the protector becomes the one who needs protecting? When honor collides with hierarchy? When a single moment of righteous fury threatens to unravel decades of tradition? This is the story of how one man's uncontrollable rage in defense of a child would expose the dark underbelly of royal politics, challenge ancient protocols, and prove that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to risk everything for what's right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldermere Palace as Captain Marcus Thornfield made his routine inspection of the royal quarters. His polished boots echoed softly through the corridors where kings had walked for centuries, each step measured and precise like everything else in his carefully ordered world. At 42, Marcus had dedicated half his life to serving the crown, rising through the ranks from a common soldier to the most trusted guardian of the royal family. The palace buzzed with its usual morning activity. Servants scurried between chambers carrying silver trays laden with breakfast, their movements choreographed by decades of tradition. Ladies in waiting whispered among themselves as they prepared for another day of court ceremonies, their silk gowns rustling like autumn leaves. Yet beneath this veneer of elegance, Marcus sensed something different in the air today. A tension that made his trained instincts prickle with unease. Princess Isabella, barely 8 years old, sat alone in the morning room, her small figure dwarfed by the ornate furniture surrounding her. Her golden hair caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, creating a halo effect that made her appear almost ethereal. But it was not her beauty that struck Marcus as he paused in the doorway. It was the profound sadness in her deep blue eyes, the way her tiny shoulders seemed to carry a weight far too heavy for someone so young. The princess had been different lately, Marcus noticed. Where once she had skipped through the palace halls with infectious laughter, now she moved quietly, almost invisibly, as if trying not to draw attention to herself. The change had been gradual but unmistakable to someone who watched over her as carefully as Marcus did. He had served as her personal guard since her birth, had been there for her first steps, her first words, her first attempts at reading in the vast palace library. Lord Chancellor Aldwin Blackthorne entered the morning room with his usual air of self-importance, his black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. A man in his 60s with sharp features and calculating gray eyes, Blackthorne had been the king's chief advisor for over 2 decades. His influence extended into every corner of the palace, and his word carried almost as much weight as royal decree itself. Marcus had never liked the man, sensing something cold and manipulative beneath his polished exterior, but personal feelings had no place in a royal guard's duties. "Your Highness?" Blackthorne's voice carried a tone of barely concealed disdain as he addressed the young princess. "Your tutors are waiting in the study chamber." "You are already 10 minutes late for your lessons." Isabella looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, her small hands trembling slightly as she closed it. "I apologize, Lord Chancellor. I was just finishing this chapter about the history of our kingdom." "Excuses are unbecoming of royalty," Blackthorne replied sharply. "Perhaps if you spent less time daydreaming and more time focusing on your duties, you would not consistently disappoint those who attempt to educate you." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched the child's face crumble at the harsh words. In all his years of service, he had witnessed many interactions between court officials and the royal family, but something about Blackthorne's treatment of Princess Isabella struck him as unnecessarily cruel. The man spoke to her not with the respect due to a member of the royal bloodline, but with the contempt one might show to a servant who had failed in their duties. The princess stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she feared making any sound that might further provoke the chancellor's anger. "Yes, Lord Chancellor, I will go to my lessons immediately." "See that you do," Blackthorne continued, his voice growing harsher. "And perhaps you might make an effort to appear more presentable. Your hair is unkempt, your dress wrinkled. What would foreign dignitaries think if they saw the future of this kingdom looking like a common street child? Marcus watched as Isabella's hand instinctively moved to smooth her hair, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She was 8 years old, for heaven's sake, and it was barely past dawn. Yet here stood a grown man, a supposed pillar of the court, berating her for the crime of looking like the child she was. "I will ask my lady-in-waiting to help me," Isabella whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "You will do more than ask," Blackthorn snapped. "You will demand better of yourself and those who serve you. Weakness is not tolerated in this family, young princess. The sooner you learn that lesson, the better prepared you will be for the responsibilities that await you." The Lord Chancellor turned and swept from the room without another word, leaving Isabella standing alone among the morning sunlight and shadows. Marcus watched as the child's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her rosy cheeks as she sank back into her chair. Her small shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Marcus felt something twist painfully in his chest. This was not the first such incident he had witnessed. Over the past several months, he had noticed Blackthorn's increasingly harsh treatment of the young princess, always when the king and queen were absent, always when there were no other witnesses of significant rank. The man seemed to take pleasure in diminishing the child, in making her feel small and inadequate. Marcus had served in wars, had faced enemy soldiers in battle, had seen death and destruction that would haunt most men's nightmares, yet nothing had prepared him for the helpless rage that filled him as he watched a powerful man systematically crush the spirit of an innocent child. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to comfort the princess, to tell Blackthorn exactly what he thought of his cruel methods. But protocol bound him as surely as iron chains. A royal guard did not interfere in matters between court officials and members of the royal family. He was there to protect against physical threats, not to mediate disputes or offer emotional support. His role was clearly defined, his boundaries explicitly set. To step outside those parameters would mean risking not just his position, but potentially his freedom, or even his life. As Isabella wiped her tears and prepared to leave for her lessons, Marcus made a decision that would have had consequences he could never have imagined. He stepped forward from his position by the door, his movement causing the princess to look up with startled eyes. "Your Highness," he said softly, his voice gentle in a way that few had ever heard. "You look perfectly beautiful this morning, as always. Any foreign dignitary would be honored to meet such a gracious and intelligent young lady." Isabella's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with a gratitude that made Marcus's heart ache. It was such a small gesture, a few kind words to counteract the poison Blackthorn had just poured into her ears. Yet the way her face lit up told him how desperately she had needed to hear something positive, something that reminded her of her worth. "Thank you, Captain Thornfield," she whispered, managing a small smile through her tears. As she left for her lessons, Marcus remained in the morning room, staring out at the palace gardens where Isabella used to play before her spirit began to dim. He had crossed a line today, had shown favoritism and offered comfort that went beyond his official duties. It was a small transgression, barely noticeable to anyone who might have witnessed it. But it was the first crack in the dam of his professional restraint, and Marcus could feel the pressure building behind it. How long could he continue to watch in silence as someone systematically destroyed the happiness of a child he had sworn to protect? How many more mornings would he stand by as Blackthorn's cruelty chipped away at Isabella's confidence and joy? The palace around him continued its ancient routines, servants going about their duties, courtiers preparing for the day's political maneuvering. Yet Marcus felt as if everything had subtly shifted, as if the very air had grown thicker and harder to breathe. Change was coming. He could sense it in his bones. And he suspected that when it arrived, nothing would ever be quite the same again. Later that morning, as Marcus took his position outside the study chamber where Isabella received her daily lessons, he could hear the sound of her reciting Latin phrases in her sweet, high voice. The tutors seemed pleased with her progress, their encouraging words a stark contrast to Blackthorn's earlier harshness. Here, at least, she was allowed to be a bright, curious child learning about the world. But even in this safe space, Marcus noticed how Isabella's voice carried a new uncertainty, how she seemed to second-guess herself before answering questions. The damage Blackthorn was inflicting was not just emotional, but educational, creating doubt in a mind that should have been free to explore and grow without fear. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the princess's interactions with various court members. He noticed how she flinched slightly when adults spoke to her in sharp tones, how she had begun to apologize for things that required no apology, how her natural exuberance had been replaced by a careful watchfulness that belonged on the face of a seasoned courtier, not an 8-year-old child. The realization that struck him most forcefully was this: Princess Isabella was learning to be afraid, not of monsters or darkness or the imaginary threats that frightened most children, but of the very people who should have been nurturing and protecting her. She was being taught that her worth was conditional, that love and approval had to be earned through perfect behavior and constant vigilance. This was not how a princess should grow up, Marcus thought as he watched her navigate the complex social dynamics of the palace with a wariness that should have been unnecessary for years to come. This was not how any child should grow up, royal or not. As evening approached and the palace began to settle into its quieter nighttime rhythms, Marcus found himself standing guard outside Isabella's chambers as she prepared for bed. Through the partially open door he could hear her lady-in-waiting reading a bedtime story, her voice soft and soothing in the lamplight. But even here, in what should have been the most peaceful moment of her day, Marcus noticed how Isabella asked questions about the story's characters. Was the princess good enough? She wanted to know. Did she try hard enough? The questions that should have been about adventure and magic instead focused on worthiness and adequacy. When the lady-in-waiting finally bid the princess good night and emerged from the chamber, Marcus caught a glimpse of Isabella lying in her vast bed looking impossibly small beneath the ornate canopy. She was staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone much older, someone who had learned that the world could be a harsh and unforgiving place. As Marcus took up his nighttime position outside her door, he made himself a promise. He would continue to watch, to document in his mind every instance of mistreatment, every cruel word, every attempt to diminish this remarkable child's spirit. And if the day came when watching was no longer enough, when his oath to protect required him to act rather than observe, then he would be ready to face whatever consequences might follow. The palace settled into silence around him, but Marcus remained alert, a guardian standing watch over more than just physical safety. He was guarding hope itself and the future of a kingdom that rested in the hands of one small, brave princess who deserved so much better than the cruelty being visited upon her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for Blackthorn to exercise his particular brand of psychological torture, but it would also bring new chances for Marcus to find ways to counteract that damage, to remind Isabella of her worth and strength. The war for the princess's spirit had begun, and Captain Marcus Thornfield intended to be on the right side of that battle no matter what it might cost him. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first witnessed Lord Chancellor Blackthorn's cruel treatment of Princess Isabella, and the situation had only grown worse. What had begun as harsh criticism had evolved into something far more sinister. A calculated campaign of psychological warfare waged against a child who had no understanding of why she had become a target. The morning found Marcus positioned outside the palace's grand dining hall, where the royal family traditionally took their breakfast together. King Edmund and Queen Marguerite had departed 2 days earlier for a diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Valeria, leaving Isabella in the care of the court officials. In their absence, Blackthorn's behavior had become increasingly bold, his cruelty more overt. Inside the dining hall, Marcus could hear the clatter of silverware against fine china, the murmur of conversation between the various nobles and courtiers who had been invited to dine with the princess. These meals were meant to be educational experiences, opportunities for Isabella to observe proper court etiquette and engage in the sophisticated discourse expected of royalty. But today, like so many recent days, the lesson would be of a different sort entirely. Princess Isabella, Blackthorn's voice carried clearly through the partially open doors, his tone already edged with disapproval. "I trust you remember the proper way to address the Duke of Westmarch when he arrives later this morning." "Yes, Lord Chancellor," Isabella replied, her small voice carefully controlled. "I am to curtsy and say, 'Your Grace, it is my honor to welcome you to Eldermere Palace,' and you are to maintain proper posture throughout the entire encounter." Blackthorn continued relentlessly. "Yesterday, during your meeting with the ambassador from Thornfield, you slouched like a common peasant girl. Such behavior is unacceptable and embarrassing to the crown." Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had been present during Isabella's meeting with the ambassador, had watched her conduct herself with remarkable poise for someone her age. She had been charming, intelligent, and appropriately formal throughout the encounter. The ambassador himself had commented on her grace and maturity. Yet here was Blackthorn rewriting history to create another opportunity to tear down the child's confidence. Isabella said quietly, "I will remember to keep my shoulders straight and my chin up." "Apologies are worthless without improvement," Blackthorn snapped. "Words mean nothing if your actions continue to disappoint. Perhaps you should practice your curtsy again, right now, so that we might identify and correct your numerous flaws." There was a scraping of chairs, and Marcus knew that Isabella was being forced to stand before the assembled courtiers like a performer on display. He could picture her small figure in the center of the room, surrounded by adults whose expressions ranged from discomfort to cruel amusement, depending on their relationship with the Lord Chancellor. "Deeper," Blackthorn commanded. "A proper curtsy shows respect. Your current attempt suggests you believe yourself above such courtesies." "Lower still. Your execution lacks grace entirely. Are you incapable of learning the most basic requirements of your position?" Marcus heard Isabella's breathing becoming labored as she repeatedly performed the curtsy. Each attempt met with harsher criticism than the last. The other courtiers remained silent, some perhaps wanting to intervene but lacking the courage to challenge Blackthorn's authority, others simply indifferent to the suffering of a child. "Enough!" Blackthorn finally declared. "Clearly, additional practice is required. You will spend the afternoon in the ballroom working with your dancing master until you can perform a proper curtsy without embarrassing yourself and this kingdom. Tamizar Codescendala." "Yes, Lord Chancellor," Isabella whispered, her voice now barely audible. Marcus closed his eyes, fighting against the rage that threatened to overwhelm his composure. This was torture, plain and simple, disguised as education but designed to humiliate and control. Every day brought new methods of psychological assault, new ways to make Isabella doubt her worth and abilities. The breakfast continued with Blackthorn holding forth on various topics of court business, occasionally directing questions toward Isabella that seemed designed more to trap than to educate. Marcus listened as the child navigated these verbal minefields with increasing skill, her answers carefully neutral and appropriately deferential. She was learning to survive in a hostile environment, developing defenses that no 8-year-old should need to possess. When the meal finally ended and the courtiers began to disperse, Marcus caught sight of Isabella as she left the dining hall. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor, her entire demeanor that of someone who had just endured an ordeal rather than enjoyed a pleasant breakfast with companions. As she passed by his position, Marcus made a decision that he knew violated every protocol of his position. He fell into step beside her, matching his pace to her smaller strides. "Princess," he said softly, ensuring that no one else could overhear their conversation. "Might I escort you to your chambers? The corridors can be treacherous in the morning light." Isabella looked up at him with surprise, then nodded gratefully. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, her tension gradually easing in his presence. Marcus had always represented safety to her, a constant guardian who asked nothing of her except that she be herself. When they reached a secluded alcove overlooking the palace gardens, Marcus stopped and turned to face the princess. "Your Highness, I want you to know that your performance at breakfast was exemplary. Your answers showed wisdom beyond your years, and your composure under pressure was remarkable. Isabella's eyes filled with tears at these unexpected words of praise. But Lord Chancellor Blackthorne said I was disappointing. He said my curtsy was terrible and that I embarrassed the kingdom. Lord Chancellor Blackthorne is wrong, Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I have served this royal family for 20 years, Princess Isabella. I have seen you grow from a baby into a remarkable young woman. You have never embarrassed this kingdom, not once. Your parents would be incredibly proud of how you have conducted yourself in their absence. The tears spilled over then, running down Isabella's cheeks as she finally allowed herself to release some of the pain she had been carrying. I try so hard to be good, Captain Thornfield. I practice my lessons every night. I try to remember all the rules and protocols, but no matter what I do, he finds fault with everything. Marcus knelt down so that he was at eye level with the princess, his formal composure softening into something more human and caring. Listen to me very carefully, Your Highness. You are not the problem here. You are intelligent, kind, gracious, and every inch the princess this kingdom deserves. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. But if I were better, if I tried harder, maybe he would be pleased with me, Isabella said, voicing the toxic logic that Blackthorne had been drilling into her young mind. No, Marcus said firmly. Some people find fault not because there is fault to be found, but because finding fault serves their own purposes. You cannot earn the approval of someone who has chosen to withhold it regardless of your actions. Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, considering his words. Is Lord Chancellor Blackthorne a bad man? The question caught Marcus off guard. How could he answer honestly without poisoning the child's mind against someone she would have to deal with for years to come? How could he protect her innocence while also giving her the tools she needed to defend herself? Lord Chancellor Blackthorne is a man who believes that fear is more effective than kindness in achieving his goals, Marcus said carefully. But you should remember that true strength comes from compassion, not cruelty. The greatest rulers in history were those who inspired love and loyalty, not terror and submission. They remained in the alcove for several more minutes, Marcus offering what comfort he could within the constraints of his position. When they finally parted ways, Isabella seemed stronger somehow, her shoulders a little straighter, her step a little firmer. It was not much, but it was something. A small light against the growing darkness that Blackthorne was trying to spread over her world. The rest of the morning passed quietly, with Isabella attending her scheduled lessons while Marcus maintained his vigilant watch. But as afternoon approached, he noticed an increase in activity throughout the palace. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying messages, stable hands prepared horses, and there was an air of anticipation that suggested important visitors were expected. His questions were answered when Sir Edmund Ravencrest, the captain of the palace guard and Marcus's immediate superior, approached with new orders. Marcus, Sir Edmund said, his weathered face grave with concern, we have received word that bandits have been sighted on the northern road. The Duke of Westmarch's convoy may be in danger. I need you to take a patrol and ensure their safe passage to the palace. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Leaving the palace meant leaving Isabella alone with Blackthorne for several hours, possibly longer if the situation with the bandits proved complicated. Every instinct screamed against abandoning his post, but he could not refuse a direct order from his superior without explaining his concerns. And explaining would require revealing his growing knowledge of Blackthorne's abuse. Of course, Sir Edmund, Marcus replied, though the words felt like poison in his mouth. How large a patrol do you require? Take 6 men, Sir Edmund instructed, well armed and mounted. The Duke travels with his own guards, but reports suggest the bandit group is larger than usual. We cannot risk any harm coming to such an important ally. As Marcus prepared to depart, he found himself torn between his duty to the crown and his protective instincts toward Isabella. Protocol demanded that he follow orders without question, but his conscience rebelled against leaving the princess vulnerable to whatever cruelty Blackthorne might devise in the absence of witnesses. In the end, duty won, as it always had throughout his career. Marcus gathered his men and prepared for the ride north, but not before making a quiet request of Thomas, a young guard who had shown both discretion and compassion in his service. "Thomas," Marcus said as they checked their weapons and saddled their horses, "I want you to pay particular attention to the princess's welfare while we are away. If anything seems amiss, anything at all, you are to send word immediately." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them without the need for explicit explanation. He too had noticed Blackthorn's treatment of Isabella, and he too felt the wrongness of it even if he lacked the authority to intervene. As Marcus led his patrol through the palace gates and onto the northern road, he cast one last look back at the towering spires of Eldermere. Somewhere within those walls, a small girl was facing another afternoon of psychological torment, and he was riding away from her when she needed protection most. The irony was not lost on him that he was leaving to protect a duke who had dozens of his own guards, while abandoning a princess who had no one else to shield her from the cruelty of those who should have been her protectors. But such were the contradictions of duty, the impossible choices that came with serving multiple loyalties in a complex world. The ride north proved to be exactly as tedious and unnecessary as Marcus had feared. The Duke of Westmarch and his considerable entourage were traveling in perfect safety, their own guards more than adequate to handle any conceivable threat. The supposed bandits turned out to be a group of displaced farmers seeking work, hardly the dangerous criminals they had been reported to be. But by the time Marcus and his patrol returned to the palace, the damage had been done. Thomas was waiting for him in the courtyard, his young face pale with distress and anger. "Captain," Thomas said urgently as Marcus dismounted, "you need to know what happened while you were gone. It was worse than anything we've seen before." Marcus felt his blood run cold as Thomas recounted the afternoon's events. In the captain's absence, Blackthorn had summoned Isabella to the throne room, where he had subjected her to hours of what he called deportment training, but what Thomas described as systematic humiliation. Standing before the empty throne where her father normally sat, Isabella had been forced to practice various court protocols while Blackthorn criticized every movement, every gesture, every expression. When she failed to meet his impossible standards, she was made to start over, again and again, until her legs shook with exhaustion and her voice cracked with unshed tears. But the worst part, Thomas reported, had come at the end. Frustrated by Isabella's inability to achieve perfection, Blackthorn had declared her unfit for royal duties and ordered her to spend the evening in the palace's meditation chamber, a cold stone room used for religious contemplation and penance. "She's been in there for 4 hours, Captain," Thomas said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. 4 hours alone in that freezing room, with nothing but a prayer stool and her own thoughts for company. And when Lady Catherine tried to bring her a blanket, Lord Chancellor Blackthorn forbade it, saying that comfort would undermine the lesson being taught. Marcus stood frozen in the courtyard, his hands clenched so tightly that his fingernails drew blood from his palms. The meditation chamber was barely larger than a cell, with no windows and no heating. To lock a child in such a place in the middle of winter was nothing short of abuse. But more than the physical discomfort was the psychological message being sent. Isabella was being taught that she was so fundamentally flawed, so inherently disappointing that she deserved to suffer for simply being herself. She was learning that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned through perfect obedience, and that failure would result in isolation and punishment. The rage that had been building in Marcus for weeks finally reached its breaking point. This was no longer about protocol or propriety or the careful balance of court politics. This was about a grown man systematically destroying a child's sense of self-worth, and Marcus could not stand by and watch it happen any longer. "Where is Lord Chancellor Blackthorn now?" Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. "In his study, Captain," Thomas replied, recognizing the dangerous tone. "He's been there since ordering the princess to the meditation chamber." Marcus handed his horse's reins to another guard and began walking toward the palace entrance, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the fury burning in his chest. Behind him, Thomas fell into step, understanding that whatever was about to happen would require witnesses. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived, and Marcus knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The careful balance he had maintained between duty and conscience was about to shatter completely, and the consequences would ripple throughout the entire kingdom. But as he climbed the palace steps, Marcus found that he no longer cared about consequences. Some things were more important than career advancement or personal safety. Some things were worth risking everything to protect. Princess Isabella was one of those things, and Lord Chancellor Blackthorne was about to learn exactly what happened when someone pushed Captain Marcus Thornfield too far. The heavy wooden doors of Lord Chancellor Blackthorne's study stood before Marcus like the gates of destiny itself. Beyond those carved oak panels lay the man who had spent months systematically destroying the spirit of an innocent child. And Marcus could feel 20 years of military discipline warring within rage that threatened to consume his very soul. Thomas had positioned himself strategically down the corridor, close enough to witness whatever was about to unfold, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability if questioned later. Other guards had begun to gather, drawn by some instinct that told them something momentous was about to occur. Word traveled quickly through the palace servant network, and already whispers were spreading about Captain Thornfield's dark expression and purposeful stride. Marcus paused for just a moment outside the study doors, his hand resting on the ornate brass handle. In that brief instant, he considered the full weight of what he was about to do. Confronting the Lord Chancellor directly would be an act of insubordination that could cost him his position, his freedom, perhaps even his life. Blackthorne was not just any court official. He was the king's most trusted advisor, a man whose influence extended into every corner of the kingdom's political machinery. But then Marcus remembered Isabella's tear-stained face, her small voice asking if she could somehow be better, somehow earn the approval that was being deliberately withheld from her. He remembered the sight of her shoulders shaking with exhaustion as she practiced curtsies in the dining hall, the way she flinched whenever adults spoke to her in sharp tones, the gradual dimming of the bright light that had once made her the joy of everyone who met her. No position was worth allowing that destruction to continue. No career was valuable enough to justify standing by while a child suffered systematic psychological torture. Marcus turned the handle and pushed open the doors without knocking, a breach of protocol so severe that it would normally warrant immediate punishment. The study beyond was a testament to Blackthorne's power and ego, filled with rare books, expensive artifacts, and portraits of influential political figures from across the known world. Heavy curtains blocked most of the afternoon light, leaving the room in a perpetual twilight that seemed to match its occupant's disposition. Lord Chancellor Blackthorne sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked up at Marcus's entrance with an expression of mild annoyance, as if being interrupted was simply another inconvenience in a day filled with them. "Captain Thornfield," Blackthorne said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension that had become his signature when dealing with those he considered beneath his station. "I was not aware that we had an appointment." Surely a man of your experience understands the importance of proper protocol when requesting audiences with palace officials. Marcus stepped fully into the room, closing the doors behind him with deliberate force. The sound echoed through the study like a gunshot, and something in his manner must have registered with Blackthorne because the older man's expression shifted from annoyance to wariness. "I am not here to request an audience, Lord Chancellor," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of steel that made the air in the room seem to crackle with tension. "I am here to discuss your treatment of Princess Isabella." Blackthorne's eyes narrowed as he set down his papers and leaned back in his chair, clearly recognizing that this conversation was not going to follow normal court conventions. "Princess Isabella is under my supervision in the absence of their majesties. Her education and discipline are matters of state policy, not subjects for discussion with palace guards." "Her education?" Marcus took a step closer to the desk, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest position that somehow managed to look more threatening than if he had been reaching for his sword. "Is that what you call locking an 8-year-old child in a freezing stone chamber for hours at a time? Is that your definition of education?" For just a moment, something flickered across Blackthorne's face. a flash of what might have been guilt or at least acknowledgement that his actions had been observed and judged, but it passed quickly, replaced by the arrogant certainty that had carried him through decades of political maneuvering. The meditation chamber serves as a place for contemplation and self-improvement, Blackthorn replied smoothly. Princess Isabella has shown consistent deficiencies in her deportment and attitude. Time spent in quiet reflection helps her understand the gravity of her shortcomings. Shortcomings? The word came out of Marcus like a growl, his composure beginning to crack as the full scope of Blackthorn's twisted logic became clear. She is 8 years old. Her only shortcoming is being unfortunate enough to fall under the supervision of a man who takes pleasure in tormenting children.
Blackthorn stood up from his desk, his own anger now beginning to show.
You forget yourself, Captain. I am the Lord Chancellor of this realm, appointed by His Majesty the King himself. You are a palace guard, nothing more. Your opinion on matters of royal education carries no weight whatsoever. My opinion carries the weight of someone who has watched you systematically destroy a child's confidence and self-worth, Marcus shot back, taking another step forward. I have seen you reduce her to tears with your constant criticism. I have watched you humiliate her in front of courtiers and servants. I have observed you isolate her from comfort and companionship as punishment for imaginary failures. The Lord Chancellor's face flushed red with indignation. How dare you question my methods? I am preparing that girl for the harsh realities of royal life. The world will not coddle her simply because she was born to the throne. She must learn discipline, self-control, and the consequences of failure. Everything I do serves the greater good of this kingdom. Everything you do serves your own twisted need to control and dominate someone who cannot fight back, Marcus replied, his voice rising despite his efforts to maintain control. You have taken a bright, joyful child and turned her into a fearful shadow of herself. You have made her believe that she is fundamentally flawed, that love and acceptance must be earned through impossible perfection. Blackthorn moved around his desk, clearly intending to use his physical presence to intimidate Marcus into backing down. But he had badly miscalculated if he thought a seasoned military officer would be cowed by political posturing. You speak of things you do not understand, Blackthorn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Royal children cannot be raised like common peasants. They must be stronger, more disciplined, more capable than ordinary people. Coddling creates weakness, and weakness in a ruler leads to the downfall of kingdoms. There is a difference between strength and cruelty, Marcus replied, standing his ground as Blackthorn approached. There is a difference between discipline and abuse. What you are doing to Princess Isabella has nothing to do with preparing her for leadership and everything to do with satisfying your own sick need to break someone's spirit. The accusation hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp and undeniable. For a long moment, neither man moved, the tension in the room so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Then Blackthorn's careful composure finally cracked completely. You insolent fool, he snarled, his cultured voice giving way to something raw and ugly. Do you think your 20 years of swinging a sword makes you qualified to judge my methods? Do you imagine that your simple soldier's mind can comprehend the complexities of molding a future queen? I comprehend enough to know that what you're doing is wrong, Marcus replied, his own anger finally breaking free of the restraints he had placed on it. I comprehend that you are a twisted, sadistic man who has found a child victim and chosen to torture her under the guise of education. Blackthorn's hand moved toward a decorative dagger displayed on his desk, and Marcus recognized the gesture for what it was, not necessarily a threat but a reminder of the power dynamics at play. The Lord Chancellor was accustomed to intimidating those who challenged him, used to having the full weight of royal authority behind his every word and action. But Marcus had faced real threats on real battlefields, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. A politician's posturing, no matter how practiced, held no terror for him. Lay a hand on that weapon, Marcus said quietly, and you will discover exactly how qualified this simple soldier's mind is at dealing with threats. Something in his tone must have penetrated Blackthorn's rage because the older man's hand stopped moving toward the dagger. Perhaps he finally realized that he was dealing with someone who would not be bullied or intimidated, someone whose protective instincts had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. "You are walking a very dangerous path, Captain Thornfield," Blackthorn said, his voice regaining some of its calculated smoothness. "I could have you arrested for insubordination. I could have you stripped of your rank and thrown in the dungeons. Your career, your life, your future. All of it rests in my hands." "Then do it," Marcus challenged, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of defiant invitation. "Call your guards. Have me arrested. Explain to the king when he returns why his most trusted royal guard was imprisoned for attempting to protect his daughter from systematic abuse." For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered in Blackthorn's eyes. Marcus could see the calculations happening behind that sharp gaze, the political mind weighing costs and benefits, risks and rewards. Having Marcus arrested would require explanations, investigations, potentially awkward questions about the specific nature of his objections to Princess Isabella's treatment. "The king trusts my judgment implicitly," Blackthorn said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "He appointed me to supervise his daughter's education precisely because he knows I will not hesitate to be firm when necessary." "Firm?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what you call it?" "Let me tell you what I call it, Lord Chancellor. I call it the actions of a coward who can only feel powerful when he has a helpless victim to dominate. I call it the behavior of a man so twisted by his own inadequacies that he must destroy a child's happiness to feel superior." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Marcus watched as Blackthorn's face went through a series of expressions: rage, fear, calculation, and something that might have been recognition of an uncomfortable truth. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold fury of a man who had been cornered and knew it. "You have made a grave mistake, Captain," Blackthorn said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to carry more menace than his earlier shouting. "You think your position gives you the right to challenge your betters, but you are about to learn otherwise. When their majesties return, I will ensure that they understand exactly what kind of man they have entrusted with their daughter's safety." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach at the threat, not for his own sake, but for Isabella's. If Blackthorn chose to spin this confrontation as evidence of the captain's unfitness for duty, it could result in his removal from the princess's protection detail. Without his watchful presence, she would be even more vulnerable to whatever cruelties the Lord Chancellor chose to inflict. But it was too late for second thoughts now. The die had been cast, the bridge had been burned, and there was nothing left but to see the confrontation through to its conclusion. "When their majesties return," Marcus said, matching Blackthorn's quiet tone with steel of his own, "I will be very interested to hear your explanation for why their daughter has lost weight, why she flinches when adults speak to her, why she has nightmares that wake the entire wing of the palace where her chambers are located." The reference to Isabella's nightmares clearly caught Blackthorn off guard. Marcus could see the surprise in his eyes, the realization that his actions had consequences he had not anticipated or perhaps had not cared to notice. "I will be fascinated," Marcus continued, pressing his advantage, "to hear you justify to King Edmund why his beloved daughter has been locked in meditation chambers, forced to practice curtsies until she collapsed from exhaustion, and subjected to constant criticism designed to make her feel worthless." "You cannot prove any of that," Blackthorn said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I do not need to prove it," Marcus replied. "I simply need to arrange for their majesties to spend time with their daughter when they return. They will see the changes in her immediately. They will notice how she has learned to fear adult displeasure, how she has lost the natural confidence that once made her such a joy to be around.